Sansa Stark, played by Sophie Turner. Then, 15. Now, 30. Daenerys Targaryen, played by Emilia Clarke. Then, 24. Now, 39. Jon Snow, played by Kit Harington. Then, 24. Now, 39. Tyrion Lannister, played by Peter Dinklage. Then, 42. Now, 56. Jaime Lannister, played by Nikolaj Coster-Waldau. Then, 40. Now, 55. Cersei Lannister, played by Lena Headey. Then, 38. Now, 52. Ned Stark, played by Sean Bean. Then, 52. Now, 67. Brienne of Tarth, played by Gwendolyn Christie. Then, 33. Now, 47. Khal Drogo, played by Jason Momoa. Then, 32. Now, 46. Marjorie Tyrell, played by Natalie Dormer. Then, 29. Now, 44. Shay, played by Sibyl Kikili. Then, 31. Now, 46. Tywin Lannister, played by Charles Dance. Then, 64. Now, 79. Bran Stark, played by Isaac Hempstead Wright. Then, 12. Now, 27. Grey Worm, played by Jacob Anderson. Then, 21. Now, 35. Missandei, played by Natalie Emmanuel. Then, 22. Now, 37. Catelyn Stark, played by Michelle Fairley. Then, 47. Now, 62. Joffrey Baratheon, played by Jack Gleeson. Then, 19. Now, 34. Talisa Stark, played by Una Chaplin. Then, 25. Now, 40. Theon Greyjoy, played by Alfie Allen. Then, 24. Now, 39. Shireen Baratheon, played by Carrie Ingram. Then, 12. Now, 26. Ygritte, played by Rose Leslie. Then, 24. Now, 39. Davos Seaworth, played by Liam Cunningham. Then, 50. Now, 66. Robb Stark, played by Richard Madden. Then, 24. Now, 39. Littlefinger, played by Aidan Gillen. Then, 42. Now, 57. Jaqen Hagar, played by Tom Laskiha. Then, 37. Now, 52. Robert Baratheon, played by Mark Addy. Then, 47. Now. Yara Greyjoy, played by Gemma Whelan. Then, 31. Now, 45. Tormund Giantsbane, played by Christopher Hivju. Then, 33. Now, 47. Lyanna Mormont, played by Bella Ramsey. Then, 13. Now, 23. Sandor Clegane, played by Rory McCann. Then, 41. Now, 56. Bronn, played by Jerome Flynn. Then, 47. Now, 62. Melisandre, played by Carice Van Houten. Then, 35. Now, 50. Samwell Tarly, played by John Bradley. Then, 22. Now, 37. Arya Stark, played by Maisie Williams. Then, 14. Now, 29. Jorah Mormont, played by Ian Glenn. Then, 49. Now, 64.